So 4 participant papers. The first one is from Madeline Storck, who she's just told me she's studying at the University of St Andrews, which was good, interesting news for me because that is in Scotland, as you probably know. My mother's from Scotland. Madeline is going to be telling us about the role of social media in political mobilization, a case study from January 2011 from the Egyptian uprising. Sounds very interesting. Yeah? Madeline.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. First of all, I just wanted to thank the ICD for giving me the opportunity to present my dissertation. I kind of stumbled into this topic, and if you had told me in October that I was going to be presenting this at a conference such as this, I probably wouldn't have believed you. So I have to say I feel a little bit out of my league, but I'll try my best to contribute something new. It's quite difficult to summarize a 10,000-word thesis into 10 minutes, but I've tried to highlight the points most relevant to our topic this week. So I begin by explaining the context in which we are examining social media, and then go through a brief case study, concluding with an analysis on how useful or not useful social media was for the Egyptian Revolution and the wider context of the Arab Spring. So I have a picture here of Tahrir Square, kind of the emblematic image of the January 25th revolution, and a quote that is by an anonymous Cairo activist that I came across over and over again in the reading that I did, which I feel kind of summarizes the way that social media has been portrayed and its use in the Egyptian Revolution. So my dissertation looked into the extent to which Egyptian activists use social media networks, such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and blogs, as tools for organizing and spreading awareness of political mobilization and the uprisings that took place in Egypt in January and February 2011. And I found that one could use established theories of communication that were developed long before the advent of social media to place its use within a wider context of communication. I focused on the uprisings in Egypt, which have been widely publicized and followed by the international community, and found that while possessing enormous potential to facilitate and speed up political activism, the internet is an inherently dialectical force that should not be treated solely as an oppressor or a liberator. The ongoing Arab Spring revolutions of 2011 have fostered a budding dialogue about the role of social media and networking as a tool for political mobilization. Some have embraced social media as an undeniable force for good, claiming that, quote, if you want to liberate a society, just give them the internet. And that was said by Wael Ghonim, who is an Egyptian Google executive and quite active in the Egyptian revolution. New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof labeled the quintessential 21st century conflict as one in which, on one side, are government thugs firing bullets, and on the other side are young protesters firing tweets. Even before the Arab Spring, the revolutions in Iran and Moldova were labeled Twitter revolutions, a phrase that the international media has embraced. And this phrase leads to an impression of a young, hip, and tech-savvy generation overthrowing dictators by monopolizing on the digital gap. Indeed, this is a story that sells. But clearly, this leads to an oversimplified version of events. And obviously, it takes much more than the internet to liberate a society. A year later, the uprisings that swept across the Middle East and North Africa are still ongoing. And due to the recent nature of these events, the academic discourse is still developing. This is not to imply that there is a lack of source of information. What sets the information apart is the nature of its sources. Indeed, my friends expressed their jealousy that I got to spend my time researching my dissertation on Twitter and Facebook instead of poring over library books. However, this did not make my pursuit any easier. Distinguishing useful information from the information overload of social media was quite challenging at times. According to the 2011 Arab Social Media Report, during the civil movements of early 2011, 94% of Tunisians got their news from social media tools, as did 88% of Egyptians. Both countries also relied the least on state-sponsored media for their information, at 40% and 36% of people in Tunisia and Egypt, respectively. Equally noteworthy, in Egypt, there are now more users of Facebook than there are subscribers to newspapers. So it goes without saying that this is not the first time a technological innovation has been used as a tool for change. The advent of Gutenberg's printing press in the 15th century played a role in undermining the power structures of its time. However, it is only centuries later that we are able to fully comprehend the impact of such a revolutionary and transformational invention. Attempting to do the same with social media today narrows the spectrum of understanding, as we lack the benefit of hindsight. With any new invention that has transformative potential, there is always the possibility of abuse. During the first century of Gutenberg's invention, print perpetuated as much blatant error as it did truth. As Richard N. Haas points out, the printing press, telegraph, telephone, radio, television, and cassettes all posed challenges to the existing order of their day. And like these earlier technologies, social media are not decisive. They can be repressed by governments as well as employed by governments to motivate their supporters. It is in light of these circumstances that I looked at the use of social media in the Egyptian revolution with a dialectical framework, acknowledging that the internet affects different societies in different ways. Though I looked at different social media networks, my analysis centered on the use of Twitter during the 18-day revolution in Cairo. And since our topic this week is the freedom of expression and the revolutions in new media, I will be focusing on the use of Twitter for citizen journalism. So for the sake of time today, I'll just focus on this aspect of my research. So now for a little theory. Political scientist Harold Lasswell formulated a theory for analyzing communication based on the question, who says what, in which channel, to whom, with what effect? And this provided an excellent starting point for analyzing the use of Twitter by Egyptian activists. Because I cannot read Arabic, I had to rely on translations provided. So my source was a collection of tweets by Egyptians across the country over the 18-day revolution. And these were translated by Alex Nuns and Nadia Idle, both Egyptian activists, in this book, Tweets from Tahrir. And if you're interested in this topic, I really highly recommend this book. It's really interesting. They basically collected tweets from like the kind of main Twitter users in Egypt and Tunisia, and then collected them all in chronological order so that you can literally follow the revolution through Twitter. And it doesn't take that long to read because they're only 140 characters or less. So I analyzed the 1,091 tweets that they had translated and categorized them based on the purpose of their message. And the categories were providing a description of events taking place, listing the demands of the protesters, giving instructions for demonstrating, expressions of solidarity, asking questions, like to each other, or just miscellaneous dialogue. So you can see that it's mostly, pretty much half of it was just miscellaneous dialogue. And when I say miscellaneous dialogue, it was usually complaints about Mubarak, about the police. But then the next biggest section was description of events on the ground. And an example would be something like this. So examples such as these aptly demonstrate the ways in which Twitter users acted as an alternative press, self-publishing their own accounts of the uprisings taking place, and thus providing their own narrative of events that were exposed to both the domestic and international audience. In this way, social media allows those far away, whether members of a diasporic community living outside Egypt or members of an international audience, to follow events, literally in real time. And when the Egyptian government shut down the internet, some individuals outside the country took it upon themselves to continue providing coverage of events. Such was the case with John Scott Railton, an American graduate student who reached out to Egyptian friends by phone to gather their accounts and observations of the ongoing protests, which he translated into tweets for his 4,000 followers. So here we can see where there is a role for social media to bring understanding and analysis of events to people far away. However, as we have discussed this week, it is within this new sphere of citizen journalism that problems of accuracy and anonymity have surfaced. So while this has also allowed for previously unheard voices to freely express their dissent, there is also the possibility for abuse. Such is the case in the example of the controversial blog, A Gay Girl in Damascus. Claiming to be the personal blog of Syrian-American lesbian Amina Abdullah Araf Olamari, the author was eventually revealed to be a 40-year-old American man, Tom McMaster, a graduate student at the University of Edinburgh. McMaster claimed to be blogging under the false identity of a Syrian woman in order to lend credibility to his reports of human rights abuse in Syria. The discovery of the hoax was met with outrage from fellow Arab bloggers who accused McMaster of undermining their own efforts for citizen journalism. And it got to the point where Tom McMaster had led people to believe that his false identity had been detained by the Syrian police. And there was actually a whole campaign on Facebook started to free her. So obviously you can see why people would be quite upset. First of all, because people are generally embarrassed when they get duped like that. But also, it does undermine the people that are really trying to spread word about what's going on. So what has social media really contributed to these revolutions? Perhaps in allowing for a more independent press to flourish. An independent and transparent media is regarded as an essential corollary of democratic society. And social media has played a defining role in acting as a check on the government. I would also argue that such forms of citizen journalism have allowed Egyptian activists to create their own narrative of the revolution, one that comes directly from the source. Perhaps the biggest challenge facing the use of social media for such forms of activism is in sustaining the momentum and translating it into political reality. as Mr. Amber told us on Wednesday, there is a big difference between winning a revolution and then reaching democracy. And if you're willing to stand up and protest, you should also be willing to take part in the process that follows. So I would like to conclude with the idea that social media cannot be treated as a form of social activism independent from the individuals who use them. It is important to remember in any analysis of the internet and its role in political activism that throughout history there have always been those individuals willing to decide that enough is enough and to take the risk of imprisonment, torture, or death to stand up to the powers that be and publicly voice their dissent. The founders of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube did not create their products with the intent of starting revolutions and ousting dictators, and though they may feel that they have played a role in the process by providing these vehicles for change, these revolutions begin in the minds and imaginations of those driving them. They choose their tools and their mediums for communication, whether it's print, radio, blogging, or just word of mouth. But the strength of activism, the strength of the movement lies ultimately in the will for activism. And it is just this will for activism that inspired the editors of Time magazine to name its Person of the Year for 2011, the Protester, and a tribute to those individuals who made up the revolutionary movements in the Middle East, as well as in other regions across the globe. Time's choice of the Protester captures the zeitgeist of the era in which the Egyptian revolution is taking place, and perhaps even defining. Thank you.
Madeline, thank you very much indeed, for that survey of the contribution of social media to the Egyptian revolution.